So let me share with you my very, very naive view, since I didn't work in this field intensively so far, on an action field theory of peripersonal space, which is a review by Buffacci and Iannetti, which was published recently, and which is quite interesting. First of all, I wanted to briefly remind to everybody, and myself first of all, what is how the PPS concept came into our world. One of the fathers of this concept is Rizzolatti, who studied neurons in premotor cortex and who demonstrated that bimodal visual and somatosensory neurons are sensitive to space, to visual stimuli located in the space around the animal. This is how the peripersonal space was defined at the first hand. Some kind of very vague idea of something that is close to the animal. That's it. Those bimodal neurons in one of the earliest papers were already subdivided into two families or subfamilies. Pericutaneous, which is still bimodal, but which respond to peripersonal space of few centimeters, and the real peripersonal space reaching distance, distant peripersonal space neurons. This is a typical illustration of what happens with a particular neuron from this area in a monkey when the tooth is stimulated, an activation, and when the visual stimulation is applied in the area next to the body of the animal without touching the animal. It's a pure visual stimulation, and this is somatosensory stimulation, and both of them respond to and both of them induce a response in the same neuron. Another paper from the same area demonstrates that the observation of an object approaching the somatosensory receptive field activates the peripersonal space neurons. In particular, if the stimulus, it's not quite clear from this illustration, but I want to highlight this. If stimulus is approaching directly towards the receptive field of the neuron discovered originally, then there will be this beautiful multimodal activation. But if this stimulus goes elsewhere on the face of this particular animal, then the response is not there anymore from that neuron. The stimulus is equally visible, but the animal sort of predicts that the stimulus will never arrive to the part of the body which is controlled by this particular neuron. Probably it will activate another neuron. Later, this direction of animal studies was very much expanded by Graziano in this beautiful paper. He demonstrates that neurons from about the same area, I'm not entirely certain about small subdivisions and subfields of the area, but roughly it is still premotor cortex. So they recorded neurons, neuronal activities from animals, and they identified first the receptive field and then corresponding peripersonal space fields for respectively somatosensory stimuli and the visual stimuli. And what they demonstrated here, which is quite interesting, is that the location of the space around the body depends strongly and it is in an anesthetized animal. So it's a quite an automatic process. The location of the peripersonal space field for those visual stimuli, it can be displaced if you change the position of the limb where the somatosensory receptive field of the neuron is located. Another very interesting observation, as I report in the same paper, is that, in fact, this activity of the neuron, probably corresponding to this somatosensory field, can be induced by a visual stimulus, number 4, which is approaching the limb of the animal, but not by the other approaching stimuli, 1, 2, or 3. And this happens if the animal fixates its gaze here, and about the same happens if the fixation point is totally different, which indicates that the response of this neuron is independent of the retinal projection and the activation of early visual cortices. Those are totally different areas which are activated here by the stimulus, let's say 1 and 4. But the response of this multimodal neuron is equivalent, which indicates more abstract, more generalized representation of the space near the body. Still, they don't. Still, they don't identify precisely what means near and what is the distance where the rise of this neuronal activity starts. Another animal study, more recent one, is about the mirror neurons, which are activated by action observation. And what they demonstrate is that those neurons, they are recorded from about the same premotor area. They can be activated by the observation of an action of other individual. If this observation happens in the peripersonal space, whatever it means, it is a dichotomic distinction here, as you can see. The activity is not there anymore, since the animal understands the difference in the situation, but understands. It is somehow represented, the difference in action observation outside and inside the peripersonal space, or here they call it workspace. But if the shield, transparent shield, is installed in front of the animal and the reaching activity is not possible anymore, the activation of the mirror neuron is reset, which already here demonstrates how conditional is the definition of what is peripersonal or reaching space here. So if the distance is the same, but the reaching activity is impossible, apparently due to the shield, then it is not work distance anymore, work space. A more recent study of the same kind, also animals, they identified and tried to segregate mirror neurons, which are activated by their definition by an observation of the grasping activity and by grasping itself. And the other subgroup of neurons is activated by observation of the object which is available for grasping. So in both cases, it is just an observation, it is not grasping. But the grasping neurons, respectively for this and this case, are activated. And what they demonstrate is that the object observation is mostly activating so-called canonical or object-oriented neurons in the peripersonal space. And nothing happens when they see an object out of the reach. Again, here it's a dichotomy and not a gradual calibration of the response. While the mirror neurons, they sort of omnivorous, and they can be activated by both action observation, far, and object observation, far and close. And those neurons are interesting for us because there is something specific. They can discriminate of what is reachable and what is not. And they illustrate their contextual sensitivity by shielding. If they install a transparent shield and the object is not reachable, it is impossible to predict the reachability, or it is possible to predict that it is non-reachable. Then the activity of those neurons is eliminated in response to the observation of such an object. You see, it's a barrier. Definition or a concept of peripersonal space. It is an adaptive ability to estimate the probability of interaction. Studies in animals, humans, demonstrating certain brain areas, including premotor and parietal cortices, which are necessary for such kind of distinction between the peripersonal and extrapersonal space. There is a number of behavioral human studies and electrophysiological evidence that you can identify this pattern of changes in responses using very different experimental setups. And that is why at the end you get a number of different definitions and different properties of peripersonal spaces as a function of the particular method which is applied. I like most of all those cognitive peripersonal space studies where you have to imagine what you can potentially do or sort of formulate the semantics of the activities applicable to this particular situation. And even in this case, when the real action is not there, it's all in the mind, there is an important distinction between what is reachable, what is closed, and what is far and non-reachable. And in my opinion, all of those experiments, they are quite consistent with the definition of PPS as the ability to estimate the probability of interaction. When you experience a contradiction between a word which is proposed as an activity for an object which is shown on the screen, you already in your mind try to predict or to estimate if the interaction of yourself with the object in this manner is likely or unlikely. You can grab a bottle, but you cannot dance with a bottle. And here we arrive to a meta-analysis where it is confirmed that frontoparietal network is reported in many neuroimaging studies dedicated to PPS and using different methodologies. And interestingly, there is a strong overlap between slightly different concepts like body ownership. We will not discuss here a lot on the body ownership in particular, but I would explore a bit more the other cognitive abilities or functions like attention and working memory. What is attention? According to Wikipedia, which is not the perfect source of the definition, but a quick one, attention is a selective prioritizing of one part of perceptual continuum, while deprioritizing the other part of the continuum. It can be space, it can be feature space, it can be many different things. It can be object space. And it is the allocation of limited cognitive processing resources. And here, using this beautiful resource neuroscience, which is so limited but useful, we are able to identify rapidly that we have a frontoparietal network, which is very likely reported in case of attention studies. You see, there is 1,800. And what is working memory? Working memory is a system responsible for temporarily holding information available for processing, which has a limited capacity as well. There is slightly less number of studies, but the overlap is striking, except the medial supplementary motor cortex. I guess it is what is shown here. The premotor cortex is reported to be activated in such tasks, and a large parietal network is reported as well. And if we go for a particular coordinate using the same neuroscience tool, we discover that working memory and control network is just in the middle of the brain cluster, which is reported in a well-known study on peripersonal space. This is where the activity of the brain is adapted in case the same visual cue is close to the hand, while nothing like this is observed in a control situation when the hand is not there. So the probability that control network and working memory is reported for the very same coordinate is very high. Well, it is premotor cortex, obviously, and eye field. If we go for other cluster, which is now parietal, I just took two of them randomly and try to see what is there. So the reported terms are movements, videos, and motor imagery, which is a very broad set of domains, not necessarily related to peripersonal space in particular. Why I'm talking about all this non-specificity is because in the paper I tried to review and report now is using this concept called interactive behavior framework. There is a lot of errors, but the idea is that frontoparietal network transforms visual input into representation of potential actions. So at the beginning there is a lot of information, some of it is lost, some of it is filtered when it is reaching premotor cortex. Then there is a loop with cerebellum and a lot of contextual selection effects there and forth from basal ganglia and prefrontal cortex. And what is important in this framework is that the selection of the action is dependent on the environmental circumstances or the context. And there is a word of interaction here. I believe that, taking broadly the circumstances, we can speak about both attention, working memory, and peripersonal space in this framework. And here is their experiment. What they do can be easily implemented in the domain of the peripersonal space research, though it is more attentional, obviously. At the beginning, there are special cues, then they hold the memory of two potential locations of the target. You see, both families are activated, but while they have their definite color cue, which refers to the stored in the working memory location, one of those families turned off, while the other, even before the go signal, is largely activated. This is what is ability to estimate the probability of interaction, and it shapes behavioral response. Now, finally, sorry for this long introduction, we arrive to Iannetti. And this is not the paper we are going to speak about today. This is somewhat earlier. But already at this point, they had sort of dilemma between the two options, whether there is one map of representation of what surrounds us and different branches of different activities, different behaviors related to the same map, or there are two different maps. And already at that point, they proposed a dual model. So they in favor of this model based on clear functional distinctions. Let's speak about what they mean by functional distinctions. Since already long time, Gentilucci and Iannetti published a number of beautiful papers on hand blink reflex, which highlights the defensive aspect of peripersonal space. If they induce, basically a startle, by medial nerve stimulation, there is a contraction of the muscles around the eye, or bicularis oculi. And it can be recorded with only a few trials because it's huge.
In those who have it.
In those who have it, and provided the stimulation is really rare and unpredictable. It's not a train. It should be once in a minute, once in a half a minute.
It's just that it's not a startle-like.
It's a startle-like because startle is also dependent. Therefore, I want to highlight important commonality between the two responses, which is a strong dependence of unpredictability and long cool-down trace. What is really the added value of Gentilucci, and it is undoubtedly strong and reliable, is an increase of this startle when the stimulation site is approaching the face. This is something which resembles to an extreme extent the peripersonal space. Why does he have a hesitation about general ability of peripersonal space as a map applicable to any kind of visual stimuli located around the body? Because this particular intensification of the hand blink reflex is observed just next to the face and nowhere else. It's quite specific. And in answer to the question, if there is a common system or distinctive modality-related systems, they propose that peripersonal space is not a single distance-based dichotomic in or out zone, like it might be formulated in many previous studies. What they believe is that, at the moment, is that peripersonal space is a set of graded fields describing behavioral relevance of actions aiming to create or avoid contact between objects and the body. And by field, they defined not the receptive fields known in neurophysiology, but a very general quantity that is somehow distributed over space and time, a more physical definition of the field. The main items of their concept is that peripersonal related measures are not binary, but graded with proximity. So if the crocodile is visible, the likelihood that the man will run gradually increased as a function of approaching the threat. And it is influenced by factors other than proximity. For example, if the crocodile is located just behind the man and he separates the man from the escape, the source of safety, the tree, this zone will be not likely attended or visited by the human. He will likely try to find other way to reach the tree. And finally, different peripersonal space-related responses exist. So here they speculate that there is a crocodile response and a tree response, and the superposition of those two, they give the final pattern of what they call here peripersonal space. And in case of just one, it will be gradually dependent on the distance from the crocodile, which is always approaching. Obviously, to a great extent, this definition is driven by their own studies with hand-blink reflex. Obviously, it is graded, and they sampled it using many different sophisticated approaches. And there is nothing like in or out response. It is really gradual. There is no saturation. The closer the hand to the face, the stronger is the response. And then the facilitation gradually extincts. It is dependent on the motion, like many other studies in peripersonal space. If the hand is approaching the face, the facilitation of the hand-blink reflex is increased. And it is contextual. Again, we face here the shield. If the shield is installed and the hand is unlikely to touch or somehow interact with the face, there is no more defacilitation. So then they show this example of neuronal activity in monkeys as a function of approaching stimulus, and they demonstrate the same graded nature in this particular case. Not in all neurons it happens this way. Still from the animal research and also from humans, they highlight that the field is instrument modifiable, graded and instrument modifiable, and motion dependent or context dependent. Living stimuli on this illustration provoke less activity than what is approaching, which might look like an expansion or shrinkage of peripersonal space. And apparently they don't like this idea at all, that this peripersonal space is shaped what they propose is that there is a number of fields and they respond selectively more or less to different sorts of the stimuli and different parts of the body. And the sum of them gives us an impression of a unique field. And again, an illustration for the motion dependence for the multisensory facilitation design. Now I want to show the part in the box 1 where they attack existing definitions of the peripersonal space. The first one, the oldest one, is just a certain distance from the body of the animal, because it is mostly the animal studies. Then the representation of the space around the body. And finally, the third definition is the space of somatosensory, non-somatosensory interaction. The latter two, they are often used together. And the authors of the paper see a lot of contradictions in using together them and independently. The first one is rejected because it is non-physiological, it's just geometrical, and therefore is not directly linked to what happens in the brain. So the second one is believed to be circular by the authors because the space is defined by the interaction, and then the interaction is interpreted from the point of view of the space. And the third one is difficult to interpret modifications and different measures. Like with the representation of one kind, they cannot marry the defensive head-centered space and, let's say, body-centered multisensory interaction design, which has a totally different geometry in the space. So to conclude, what they propose is that PPS-related measures are not binary, but graded with proximity. It is influenced by factors other than proximity, which is well known and important, and that different PPS-related responses exist. Therefore, PPS is a set of fields of behavioral relevance for actions related to physical contact. And my final remark on this is how, in fact, can we dissociate the two alternative points of view, two alternative theories, different overlapping fields, or one field of probability of interaction, but different actions are modified by this probability, dependent on the context and the specific body part and the specific response you probe. I think that we have to try to modify one field intentionally and to probe the other field. And if we get a universal modification of many different fields, really different and distant in their experimental design, then it is more likely to believe that there is a general map or representation of the space, and more likely not the space, but the likelihood of interaction with objects around us. And this is how I might propose to do it. Yeah. So we have instruments to expand perceived likelihood of interaction, and then we stimulate the hand and we measure the function of the distance, the proximity, and the facilitation. The facilitation must increase at the distant part where the map of the probability of interaction is possible to be expanded.